I'm currently 5 or 6 meters under the streets of Warsaw. And it's no exaggeration to say that when you walk on the streets of Warsaw, you're walking on the graves of tens of thousands of people who were murdered and executed. Thousands of people who fought for the city's freedom. Warsaw's story is quite extraordinary. It's quite unique because this is a city which didn't accept slavery. It rose up on the 1st of August 1944. The whole of the city taken over by the Polish resistance. The German response to that attack was something quite extraordinary. Hitler ordered that every stone, every building be completely destroyed so that Warsaw would be razed from the face of the earth. Lightly armed and left alone, unaided by their allies just a few dozen kilometers away, the Polish resistance put up the most extraordinary fight that any capital city had seen in the whole of the Second World War. More people died here in Warsaw, above us, and in these sewers in those few days than in the whole of France during the whole of the Second World War. So I'm absolutely delighted to announce that together with the Polish Security Printing Works, we'll be launching a new series called 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, in which we describe the story of the incredible men, women and children who fought here in Warsaw. Every single day, from the first day of the uprising to the last day, we'll be releasing a short 1 or 2 minute film in the English language, which will be going out on my channel. This is the first time that anybody has ever attempted to tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising in English and in video in the places where it really happened. And it won't just be tactics and strategy, we'll be hearing the story of those men, women and children who fought above us and died in the tunnels in which we're now in. I'm absolutely delighted that the Polish Security Printing Works have been able to make this project happen. You're going to see a side of Warsaw that you would never get if you came here as a tourist. And this project will be hosted on the Polish Security Printing Works special website for this project, 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage in the future. Now this has all been made possible because of the foundation, Fortress Polish Security Printing Works, one of which's aims is to make sure that foreigners, English language speakers, non-Polish speakers, learn about Poland's history and the story of Warsaw. And that is because for 27 days, Polish Security Printing Works was a key fortress in the north of the Old Town. If that fortress remained, the Old Town was safe. If it fell, the entire battle for Warsaw was in doubt. I invite you now to support this project by tuning in every day at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for each episode of this story, 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Dziękuję serdecznie, thank you very much, from the sewers of Warsaw, the city that survived its own death. It's 5 o'clock on the 1st of August 1944, and after 5 years of tyranny, the people of Warsaw finally begin their long-awaited uprising. 50,000 troops, of which less than 10% are armed with light weaponry, will rise up against 20,000 heavily armed German troops. The Poles knew this would be an unequal struggle, but they were counting on their allies, the Soviets, with being able to help and support them within a few days. It's a blisteringly hot day as the battle begins, and the fighting is intense. The Poles are unable to capture many of the key strategic locations around the city, including, most importantly, the airport, but they do manage to take the tallest building in Warsaw, the Prudential building. For the first time, Poles are able to see their flag flying across the city. The joy and the intensity of the celebration at seeing freedom once again for the first time in years was incredible. On hearing the news that the much-hated Poles had finally risen up in their capital, the Nazis are incensed. Reichsführer, the SS Heinrich Himmler, orders that the city be completely destroyed and that every inhabitant murdered. Tune in tomorrow at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, and search for the hashtag 63days to share your opinion. 2nd of August 1944, and the Home Army and uprising soldiers are able to capture the whole of the old town that you see behind me. And crucially, they also capture the Polish security printing works where I am now. And this was a hugely important building, not only because it looked out throughout the whole of the old town, but also because it commanded a strategic position across the Vistula River to the north and also to the other side of the river where the German forces were. Now, this was one of the most hotly contested and hard-fought locations throughout the uprising, and it was hugely important to both sides. Luckily, the Poles had underground resistance inside the building who were able to help their brother-in-arms when they attacked from the outside. Now, imagine the joy and the euphoria. For the past 5 years, the people of Warsaw, as with all of the people across Poland, never knew when they left their homes whether they would be rounded up in a mass execution and shot, sent to a concentration camp, or sent to forced labour. They never knew if their brothers, their fathers, their husbands, their sisters, their daughters, when they left the house, would have the same fate. They had to watch as their neighbours' houses were destroyed, as everything they owned was plundered, as their businesses were stolen from them. They had to watch as 1,000 years of Jewish history in Poland were destroyed in the Warsaw Ghetto. And as they woke on the 2nd of August, they woke to the Polish flag flying on buildings across the city. They woke for the first time in 5 years to the sound and to the feeling of freedom. Despite the joy of that moment, many hundreds of thousands of people would have to die before the true flag of freedom would fly above Warsaw's skyline. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, everywhere you walk in Warsaw, you're going to see shrapnel holes and bullet holes like this. And in this series of films, what we're trying to do is tell the story of the people, the men, the women, the children who fought and died on Warsaw streets and what freedom meant for them. Don't forget to tune in to the next episode tomorrow at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your comment and reaction using the hashtag 63days. 3rd of August 1944. Here in the leafy northern district of Żoliborz, the Warsaw Rising had actually begun too early on the day on the 1st, when soldiers of the 9th Company, nicknamed Reaper, met a German patrol. And all around the city, people were walking around on a hot day with long coats, with barrels pointing out of the bottom of the coats, and they exchanged fire. The Germans were alarmed by the shooting and were aware that a rising was expected to take place for some time. They managed to reinforce many of the key strategic areas in the city, like the viaducts, rail crossings, and bridges. Despite this, the Poles were able to take over almost all of the Żoliborz district without hardly a shot being fired. Then, some of the units that were stationed here were ordered, because Żoliborz is in the north of the city, to the Campinos forest. One of the ironies of the Warsaw Rising was that the Poles had actually been preparing for a national uprising, not just one in the capital, and made the decision to send both troops and ammunition and weaponry out of the city before the rising began. This is just one of the many controversial decisions which later on the Poles would pay a heavy price for, and which make the Warsaw Uprising still a hotly debated subject to this day. And here we are at one of the many Napoleonic-era fortresses that ring the outside of Warsaw. And on this day in 1944, the Poles attacked this citadel. Now, whilst the walls here were built in the 19th century, the MG42 German heavy machine guns that were pointing out at them most definitely weren't. And the Polish resistance fighters were pushed back and were never able to capture these key defensive points in the city. The Żoliborz district is one of the few areas in the city in which you can still see the original buildings which survived the war. The rest of Warsaw was completely and utterly destroyed. A story that we're going to tell over all of the coming episodes of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Thanks very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this film, comment underneath, and don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, searching for the hashtag 63days. 4th of August 1944, and Russian troops of the German Rona Brigade, led by General Kamiński, start to murder civilians in the southwest Ochota district of Warsaw. Throughout the course of the uprising, over 10,000 civilians are murdered in just this area alone. Nurses are gang raped and then executed. Wounded fighters are shot in their bed. Children are thrown into burning buildings, and civilians are shot and dumped in mass graves. In the centre of the city,
Furious fighting continues for the key strategic positions which both the Germans and the Poles need to be able to control if they want to win this battle, including the Prudential building, which the Poles were able to capture the opening floors of on the first day of the fight. The Germans' advantage of heavy artillery and air attacks starts to really prove its weight. In the western district of Wola, SS units led by Oskar Dielwanger and Heinz Reitfahrt began their specialisation of the genocide of civilians. They perfected the craft in Belarus, Russia and eastern Poland before being moved to Warsaw. Thanks for watching. Check out tomorrow's episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, which will be released at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Share your opinion and your comment using the hashtag 63days. Over the night of the 4th and 5th of August, British bombers start to land supplies directly through to Warsaw Uprising fighters. Because of the tremendous distance as they're flying from Italy, many of the planes don't make it, and the mission is almost considered suicidal. Later on, they're joined by Canadian, American and South African bomber crews, all struggling to get supplies through to the rising fighters. The operation to send supplies is hampered by the fact that the Soviets refused to allow the Allied planes to refuel and resupply in Soviet territory, which is only a few kilometres away from Warsaw. In Wola, in the western side of the city, the SS units led by Dielwanger and Reitfahrt began their genocide of the civilians hiding there. On the first day, between 20 and 40,000 people were murdered. In the following days, up to 60,000 people were murdered in the most bestial way, shot dead in cold blood, burnt alive, or buried alive by explosions. After murdering the civilians in their tens of thousands, the Nazis began systematically looting and taking anything of any value they could get their hands on. It's estimated that up to 60,000 wagons and truckloads of material were taken, looted and stolen away from the inhabitants of Warsaw during this period. It was also on this day that resistance fighters attacked and overran a concentration camp that held over 300 Jewish men and women. The Jewish prisoners were freed, and many of them went on to support and fight in the uprising itself. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please share this film and your comments using the hashtag 63days. See you tomorrow for the next episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 6th of August 1944. Because of the difficulty of moving about on the streets, the resistance fighters become increasingly isolated in their pockets around the city. So on the night of the 6th of August, some of the resistance fighters who are in the Mokotów district crawl through the sewers of the city to get here to where we are right now on Wilczek Street. Now just think about that for a second. They had to crawl in the dark through thousands of yards of dirt and filth, braving grenades that the German troops would drop down there, as well as gas, braving drowning and panic in order to be able to get here. That was how desperate and how brave these people were. Although by now the Nazis have set up transit camp civilians in Pruszków, through which over 500,000 people will pass, the mass murder of civilians throughout the city continues. Wanda Ruri is a heavily pregnant mother of 3 children, aged 6, 3.5 and 11. They're hiding in their cellar when German and Ukrainian auxiliary units arrive. They kick them out, bring them into the courtyard, and then march them with hundreds of other people to an area where there are hundreds of bodies lying around. Nobody was in any illusion what was going to happen to them. Wanda and her children somehow hang at the back of these groups of people who are being systematically shot down in rows. She's in the last group. As she's pleading for her life and the life of her children, they're marched up to where the rest of the bodies are. And in front of her, her children are shot. As is Wanda. But somehow, although she's shot, she manages to survive. She falls down and she lies with all the other bodies. As she's lying there, she hears again and again hundreds of shots. There are now thousands of bodies lying all around in this area. For 3 days and 3 nights, she lies surrounded by those bodies, heavily pregnant, and surrounded by the bodies of the children that she loved who had been murdered around her. Somehow, she found the strength to continue when she felt the baby that was inside of her kicking for life. After 3 days and 3 nights, surviving more shootings, dogs hunting for people who are still alive, who were then murdered, she crawls during the middle of the night on her hands and knees past all of these bodies and somehow, incredibly, makes it to safety. Thanks very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the bone-chilling tale of the heroic defence of Warsaw. If you like this episode, please share it. Please write a comment in the comments section. And also, don't forget to check in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, searching for the hashtag 63days. 7th of August 1944. The Germans attempt again and again to recapture the Polish security printing works, which they're bombarding with heavy artillery. But each time they attack, they're fought back. Despite their dominance of the air and their use of heavy artillery, the Poles prove themselves more than a match for their German equivalents. As a result, the Nazis are forced into ever more desperate measures in order to recapture territory. They force civilians, men, women and children, to march in front of the tanks as they advance on the Polish positions. The Polish resistance fighters are presented with a terrible choice: to shoot and murder the people they're trying to protect, or not to shoot and allow the Germans to be able to capture their positions. All across the city, the Poles are forced to take to the cellars, and if they want to get from one building to another, it could take a whole day. As a result, they start to dig tunnels. The defence of Jerusalem Avenue, the main thoroughfare in the city, which was kept open throughout the uprising, was commemorated by President Trump when he visited Warsaw, his first trip to Europe as a president, in 2017. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your reaction using the hashtag 63days. 8th of August 1944. The fight for the narrow cobbled streets of Warsaw's Old Town increases in frequency and intensity. It's hand-to-hand fighting, and every room, every floor and every building is hotly contested. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Polish resistance fighters prove themselves experts at recapturing positions that they've lost during the night. The Nazi Germans capture civilian men and force them to collect the dead bodies and then burn them. The men selected for this task were to be executed soon after in a futile attempt to cover up this crime. Experts estimate that in the Wola district alone, there are up to 12 tons of burnt human remains lying underneath the city's streets, which means there's up to 40,000 bodies that lie there. Among them was a young 15-year-old nurse called Leocadia, my wife's great aunt, who was murdered along with all the other young nurses who were helping injured patients in a hospital in Wola. Her body was only identified by the simple child's bracelet that she wore on her arm, which was dumped along with her in the mass grave and set on fire. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Tune in tomorrow at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear the next episode. And don't forget to share your views and comments using the hashtag 63days. 9th of August 1944. Alongside the bombardment of the city by heavy artillery, the Germans are able to use Stuka dive bombers to inflict widespread destruction across the city. With no air support of their own and using only light weaponry, the Poles are unable to fight back against this air menace and have to watch as the city is destroyed brick by brick and house by house. At the Polish security printing works, as in so much of the city, underground tunnels are dug so that fighters can get from one building to another. In the darkness, they go out to try and take out the artillery that's pounding the city, but are lit up by flares and beaten back by heavy machine guns. Across the city, resistance fighters push back attack after attack, with conditions getting worse and worse inside the city as supplies run out. Despite this, there is still a hope that the Allies, and in particular the Soviet forces just across the river who'd encouraged the Poles to rise up, will come to their rescue. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please share your opinion using the hashtag 63days and look out for the next episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 10th of August 1944, and the BBC start to report that the Polish Home Army is sending messages confirming that German soldiers and German troops are shooting captured prisoners and injured civilians and are using men, women and children as human shields for their troops and for their tanks. The BBC warned that this breaks the international rules of war and the code of the Geneva Convention, and that those responsible will be captured and tried for their crimes. Judging by the actions of the Germans in Warsaw from that moment onwards, that warning and that appeal truly fell on deaf ears. The Germans are by now bombarding Warsaw with a 24-inch heavy gun which fires shells weighing almost 5,000 pounds. Now, because these shells were made to hit concrete and bunkers, sometimes when they hit soft ground, the rebels were actually able to defuse the bombs and then reuse the explosives in one of the hundreds of underground munitions factories that dotted around the city. The Polish uprising soldiers didn't consider themselves rebels or resistance fighters. They considered themselves soldiers of the true Republic of Poland, the government of which was in exile in London. As a result, they largely followed the rules of the Geneva Convention, and when they took prisoners, they didn't shoot them. The exception to which was the much-hated SS soldiers, Hitler's elite, who were often shot on the spot. Now, in one of the cruel ironies of fate which war so often brings, the German prisoners were kept in the courtyards of buildings. There was nowhere else to put them. And as a result, when the Stuka dive bombers would come in and attack and they would see groups of men, they would end up very often bombing their own troops. Thanks very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising and the destruction of Warsaw. Don't forget to tune in for the next episode tomorrow at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your opinion and comments using the hashtag 63days. The streets of Warsaw's old town are filled with happy people enjoying the summer sun. But on the 11th of August 1944, this scene was entirely different. The entire of the city was enveloped in flames. Smoke billowed into the sky. After murdering tens of thousands of people in the Wola and Ochota districts, those areas were finally captured by the Germans. Warsaw was in the process of being completely and utterly destroyed. It becomes increasingly clear to the Polish resistance that the help that was offered to the resistance by the Soviets when they sent over leaflets and radio broadcasts saying they would help will not materialise. It's also increasingly clear that the Western allies, the British and the Americans, are limited in what they can offer the resistance. This fight is one that the Poles will have to carry out themselves. In order to survive the heavy fighting and fierce bombardment, the inhabitants of Warsaw are forced to take to homemade shelters and underground cellars. One of them is Władysław Szpilman, the central hero in the film The Pianist, who somehow survives the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Uprising. Because of the forced evacuation of civilians, by the end of the war, Warsaw, a city of over 1 million inhabitants, will be reduced to just a few thousand people. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your reaction using the hashtag 63days. 12th of August 1944. All over Warsaw, resistance fighters are bravely fighting against attack after attack. But the Germans' dominance of the air, their use of heavy artillery and flamethrowers, as well as mass murder, forces the insurgents back into ever smaller pockets of resistance. The world knew that the Warsaw Uprising was taking place. A young British airman, John Ward, who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp and made his way to Warsaw, fought on the front lines and by night sent back communiques to the BBC pleading for help. Winston Churchill writes desperately to Stalin to ask him to support the resistance fighters, but his appeals for support fall again and again on deaf ears. The Soviet leader knew very well that the people who were fighting in Warsaw could be the future resistance to the communist government that he intended to impose on Poland at the war's end. This really is the greatest and most tragic irony of the Warsaw Uprising. The very people who were there and supposed to be helping these resistance fighters were the ones to let them down and betray them. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow for the next episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your comment and your thoughts and reaction using the hashtag 63days. 13th of August 1944. A young Polish resistance fighter called Stanisław Likiernik is brought into this hospital. He's been lightly wounded. As he lies in his hospital bed, he hears a tremendous noise. The Polish underground fighters have been able to capture a tank that the Germans have abandoned on the outskirts of the old town. They bring it into the old town, right where I am right now. And there's a tremendous crowd that comes together. Women, children, resistance fighters, all gathering around and celebrating this fantastic achievement. Then suddenly, Likianik hears a huge explosion. The entire core of the building of the hospital in which he's in seems to shake from the very roots. The Germans had filled the tank with hundreds of pounds of high explosives and then detonated it. Over 300 people were killed, men, women, and children. Likianik described how the body parts of these people blew up for hundreds of yards around. And a young nurse who was injured by the blast described how she couldn't wash the blood out of her hair for days. Whenever an uprising fighter from that moment onwards would tell Likianik how he missed those moments of freedom in Warsaw, he would always remember the moment when he had to pick up the brains, the spinal columns, the legs, the hands, and the other mutilated limbs of the hundreds of people who were murdered that day. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next episode, and to share your comments using the hashtag 63days. 14th of August 1944. When Germany invaded Poland, Poland was also invaded 2 weeks later by Russia in a secret German-Russian pact. Now, because Poland had been attacked from both sides, it was too difficult to defend, and after weeks of heroic fighting, eventually the Polish army collapsed. This gave Polish soldiers, Polish airmen, a conundrum. They wanted to carry on the fight to defend their homeland, but that homeland no longer existed. So they made it work out any way they could to get first to France and then to the UK to continue the fight. Over 1 million Polish citizens were then deported by the Russians in the area controlled by Soviet Russia to Siberia. And later on, Stalin, when it suited him, made an army from those Polish men in order to carry on the fight. The commander of the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, General Sosabowski, pleaded to allow to have his airborne troops flown into Warsaw to help the defence, a mission that they'd been training for ever since the brigade was created. His mission was refused. The troops would later on be used in the failed Operation Market Garden later on in 1944. And they, like all the civilians and other soldiers of Poland who were exiles from their homeland, had to listen to the news and radio reports as their capital went up in flames. Trying to understand the values that the people who fought in the Warsaw Rising were living up to can be quite hard for a modern generation. But I think what sums it up best is this excerpt from an opinion piece that was written on this day in 1944. It is the role of every generation of Poles not only to suffer, but to fight. Suffering brings out in us the will to fight. Trying to rob us of freedom is a hopeless task. And you'll see over every episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage how the young resistance fighters lived up to those ideals. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to share this film and write your view underneath using the hashtag 63days. 15th of August 1944. The whole of Warsaw lies in flames. The city is being blown up and burnt to death. The fine palatial streets lie in rubble. Anyone daring to venture outside during the day will be shot on the spot by a sniper or killed by artillery fire. As a result, supplies start to run low. The soldiers and civilians will eat literally anything they can get their hands on. The pigeons, the cats, the dogs, they all start to disappear. The most common meal at this time was not so affectionately known as spit soup. There's food aplenty in the city's allotments, but to go out there means certain death. A young 13-year-old boy, Jan Galinowski, is forced to watch as his favourite cat starves to death in front of him. So if you were a civilian in the Rising, what would you do? You hadn't picked this fight, but it had been forced on you. Would you stay, or would you try and get out? Which decision would be the best one for you and your family? What's so incredible about the Rising is the sheer number of civilians who decided to stay and who decided to help. Now, perhaps because of the genocide of civilians throughout the city, they really had no choice. But the level of organisation and discipline was still high. Every district had its own mayor. Every housing block had its own self-help committee. The civilians were the ones who were keeping this rising going. They built barricades, they starved hospitals, they shared their food, and without them, the rising wouldn't have been able to carry on. But how long would you be able to carry on that fight? By the 15th of August, the civilians in Warsaw had been forced to watch as their homes were destroyed, their neighbours murdered, as they lost contact with their friends and relatives. And the question was, how long could they put up with that? The simple fact is that the Warsaw Uprising and the misery for civilians would carry on for many days to come. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Share your view in the comments section below and share this film with someone who you think might appreciate it. 16th of August 1944, a day of ferocious fighting across the whole of Warsaw. The Germans try and attack here in the Old Town as well as in the centre of the city. They storm a monastery on Theatre Square, and again they attack the Polish security printing house, but are again rebuffed. The young men and women fighting in the Warsaw Uprising were idealistic and creative. Two of Poland's finest poets, Tadeusz Gajca and Zdzisław Stroiński, were killed on this day. Not for nothing did many people realise that not only was the city of Warsaw being destroyed around them, but perhaps one of Poland's finest generations as well. Soldiers were young people, and they weren't fighting all the time. In the evenings, they gathered together for mass, they sang patriotic songs, and they did what all young people do. One soldier recounted the story of a colleague of his, codenamed Hawk, who had a girlfriend called Helena. One night, Hawk and Helena decided to get married. In a break between the artillery fire, they rushed to a cathedral where the priest married them. The witness at the wedding was brought in on the back of one of his friends as he'd been hit in the legs coming to the church. After a short celebration, everybody went back to their positions, and within a few moments, the next artillery round started flying in. Hawk and Helena were hit by one of them. They lived and died together. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we try and tell the story of people like Hawk and Helena. Don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your opinion and this story. "17th of August 1944, a young Polish soldier called Zbigniew Błykiewicz, codenamed Notch, is asleep in his bed. Suddenly, he's awoken by a tremendous boom. His house and the area around it has been hit by a rocket launcher that the Poles called the Bellowing Cow and the Germans called the Nebelwerfer. This was a particular type of rocket that could be filled either with high explosive or with fuel. It would make a terrible screeching sound, followed by a few seconds of silence, followed by an explosion. The soldier Notch is woken up. He hears that the flames around him are burning, but because he thinks that probably no one's injured, he does what most soldiers do in times of war when they can, and falls fast back to sleep. The battle for Warsaw continues to rage. Again, the Germans use women as human shields in front of their tanks as they attack in the Muranów district of the city. Again, the Germans try and take the Polish security printing works, and again they're pushed back. And again, John Ward, a young British flight lieutenant who escaped from a prisoner of war camp and is now fighting on the front lines with the Polish Home Army, sends back desperate messages to London, pleading for support. The Bellowing Cow or the Nebelwerfer wasn't the only vicious type of weapon that was used in this fight. The Germans also employed a particular type of remote-controlled tank, a little mini tank that was filled with explosives. And that tank would be driven up, commanded by a wire, up to a barricade or up to a house, and then detonated, causing a huge explosion. So the Poles start to build barricades beyond the barricades. And one particularly brave way to take out this tank was for a resistance fighter, for an insurgent, to take his knife, brave the sniper fire, brave the machine gun fire, and try and crawl through the rubble and cut that wire before this little mini tank called a Goliath would reach its objective. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the incredible story of the Warsaw Uprising. Tune in tomorrow at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the next episode, and share your comments, your thoughts and your opinion using the hashtag 63days. 18th of August 1944. Desperate pleas by the Polish Home Army and the American and British governments to Stalin to ask for more support for the resistance and underground go unheeded. The American ambassador had gone to go and see Stalin himself personally, and a young George Kennan, who would later go on to play an integral role in shaping America's foreign policy during the Cold War, described the discussion that the ambassador had with Stalin when he came back and told Kennan. He said that Stalin had effectively said, "We intend to have Poland lock, stock and barrel. We don't care about these underground resistance fighters, and if they and the Germans want to kill each other, well, that's fine by us." Even the Germans can't understand what's going on. The commander of the SS forces throughout the city, Erich von den Bach, writes in his diary, "The Poles are fighting bitterly, house by house, and every hour we're waiting for the Russians to attack." He even sends an offer to the Polish commander Komorowski to join forces to fight the Russians, an offer that was rejected. Fighting street to street, house to house, meant that death could come at any time. On the 18th of August, a young Polish resistance fighter called Wacław Zagorski is looking for food. And somewhere on the front line, there's a dentist's office, which is neither controlled by the Polish or the Germans. As he slowly creeps into the office, he sees through the window a German soldier sitting on the ground. He takes out his rifle, takes aim, and shoots the man dead. In his memoirs, Wacław recalls how he always felt so guilty about that because the man hadn't been trying to kill him, didn't have a gun in his hands, and he felt that that was murder. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of a people who refused to surrender and fought for freedom. Make sure you tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your reaction, your views, and your comments using the hashtag 63days. 19th of August 1944, and the Germans again attack using artillery and air attacks the old town behind me, and again are repulsed. Because of the heavy losses they're taking, they decide to switch to a tactic which they used with extreme effect in the Wola and Ochota districts, where they murdered tens of thousands of civilians. Fire. They start to burn building by building so that anyone inside either suffocates, has to escape, or is burnt to death. Again, they attack the Polish security printing works, which is defended by hundreds of uprising fighters, and again, they're repulsed. Fighting is also intense around the Warsaw Polytechnic University where we are here. On this day, just here, Tadeusz Semedini is killed, taking out a tank on his own with just a Molotov cocktail. On the same day, in 1944, his son was also killed. Both Tadeusz and Alan were awarded Poland's highest military honours. I once had the privilege of meeting Bogdan Dębinski, codename M3, from the Odvet Battalion, and he told me how his colleagues in his unit on the building opposite him on Nowakovsky Street had been executed. Then all of a sudden, he's pulled out the cellar in which he's hiding with a number of his other colleagues and pushed up against the wall by Ukrainian auxiliaries. They start stripping them of their valuables and they have their rifles levelled at them, and at any moment, they know they're going to be shot. Then all of a sudden, the owner of the building, the civilian owner of the building that they were staying in, comes up to them and he speaks some Ukrainian. And he tells them he wants to take his photo. So they all line up, the Ukrainian soldiers with their weaponry and the prisoners, and they take the photo. And then when the Ukrainians found out they weren't going to get the photo straight away, they smashed the camera. But somehow this civilian, who Bogdan had never even met before, saved his life. He described how every single moment, every single second ticked like a clock and took an agonising age to finish. And yet somehow he survived. Thanks very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this film, comment underneath, and don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, searching for the hashtag 63days. 20th of August 1944. In the dead of the night, over 1,000 Polish soldiers try and creep silently across these railway tracks so they can reinforce their comrades in the old town. The Germans are expecting this and meet them with a hail of machine gun fire and a hurricane of tank shells. The Poles are pushed back, with over 100 men lost. The next night, they try again, and this time, 300 are killed. With every defeat, there also comes a victory. On this day, the Poles launch a daring raid on the Pasta building, which you can see behind me. To get into the building, they use a team of female sappers. One of them, Barbara Matis-Wysiadecka, described how she placed the charges against the wall, They ran for cover, the explosion went off, and the troops came racing in. They discovered a diary on one of the German prisoners, Kurt Heller, that described the conditions inside this building which had held out all of this time. He said they were running low on food, on ammunition, most of their colleagues had been killed. Some of the German soldiers even committed suicide because they couldn't take it, and the stink of dead bodies, unburied dead bodies, was rife in the air. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the inspiring men, women, and children who wouldn't accept slavery. Tune in for the next episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share this film and your opinion using the hashtag 63days. 21st of August 1944. The SS units of Dierwang and Rheinfahrt that had proved so good at murdering unarmed civilians in the Wola and Ochota districts of the city are having a lot less luck in the Old Town up against armed and determined resistance fighters. The attacks on the Old Town continue. The Poles are actually able to capture a whole bunch of camera equipment, which they put to good use, recognising the value that this can bring by being able to share and show their experience. So you have these brave men armed with nothing but a camera going out and recording the actual battles, and these are available online if you want to go and have a look. And what's extraordinary is you really get the sense of a city being engulfed in flames, as well as the personal courage of these men who went out not with a weapon, but with a camera. Kamila Merwatowa is a young Polish nurse in a hospital in the Old Town. And on the 18th of August, she described how German troops and Ukrainian auxiliary units came rushing into the hospital. They set about beating the patients to death, clubbing them with the butts of their rifles, stabbing them with their bayonets. Suddenly she falls into a conversation, because she speaks German, with one of the German soldiers. And he looks at her with this look of pity on his face and rushes her out the hospital. And as they both come out the hospital, the troops that have entered the building set it on fire, burning everyone that was left inside to death. That's how close she came that day to dying herself, saved only by the kindness of a total stranger and an enemy soldier. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share this film and your views using the hashtag 63days. 22nd of August 1944. After an unsuccessful attempt to break out from the Old Town to the Żoliborz district, the Zoszka battalion are forced to withdraw through the Polonia Warsaw Stadium, which is behind me. Because they can't take their heavily wounded with them, they're forced to leave them here on the actual stadium pitch itself. Later on in the day, a young uprising soldier watches from the first floor of a building as the Germans come into this area and drive over the wounded who are lying up in ranks with a tank, crushing them to death. A big attack on the Gdansk railway station is also rebuffed, leaving 400 troops dead. Too often, the Poles, who were underarmed and had no means of communicating with other units around the city, were poor in attacking, but great in defending. And the lack of weaponry, heavy weaponry and ammunition shows up time and time again. You can't replace those things with bravery. The Germans too are also burrowing into the ground to try and get away from the fire as well. And they're also moving through the passages where the fighting literally was hand to hand. I once had the honour of meeting Professor Witold Kieszun, who told me that he'd actually come across a German soldier in a passageway and had shot him in the back. And as the man fell down and died, he shouted out one word: "Mother." Professor Kieszun told me how that word and that man saying that word stayed with him for years. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this film and don't forget to tune in for the next episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, using the hashtag 63days. 23rd of August 1944. We previously heard about Witold Kieszun, codename Raider. And on this day, Kieszun on his own decided to go through a gateway. And as he went through the gateway, he walked into a room. And in the room were 14 German soldiers sitting around a table filled with guns and ammunition. He tries to shoot them. Click. His gun doesn't fire. He tries to shoot again. it doesn't fire. So he does the only thing he can think of. He just runs in there shouting, hands up, everybody surrender. And to his surprise, and to their surprise, the German soldiers decide to do exactly that. And he bundles them out, captures the weapons, and takes them back to his own unit. The Poles weren't always so unlucky as attacking as at the Gdansk railway station. On the 23rd of August, they attacked the Holy Cross Church behind me, which holds Chopin's heart, and this building, which was a German gendarmerie police station. As a result, they captured dozens of German police officers and freed 20 Polish policemen who'd been holed up in there as prisoners. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this film and your opinion using the hashtag 63days. And don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 24th of August 1944. The Polish radio makes a desperate appeal to the International Red Cross to look after the over 500,000 civilians who are going through the Pruszków clearing centre. These are people who were fortunate not to get murdered, but are now being sent with no food and no support whatsoever onto this clearing camp and then onto concentration camps and work camps across Germany and through occupied Poland. The Polish underground also sent a message of support to the French underground, who, alongside the British and American allies, have just captured Paris. The comparison with Warsaw is sickeningly ironic. Paris was given up by its German commander with hardly a shot fired. Warsaw is a fight to the death. Paris's beautiful architecture lies largely untouched. The city of Warsaw is being reduced to ashes and rubble. When the Warsaw Uprising was over, the city would be occupied by Soviet troops and a Soviet government that would impose communism on Poland. Although Polish soldiers had fought on the land, airmen in the air, and navy in the seas, and they were on the side of the troops that won, Poland was subjugated to a government it didn't want and didn't vote for. Paris was free, Warsaw was not. The tale of these two cities is the tale of these two nations. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. If the story of the people of Warsaw fighting for their freedom and ours has inspired you, please share this film and share your opinion using the hashtag 63days. Tomorrow's episode will be at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 25th of August 1944, and the commanders of the Polish Home Army are forced to make a terrible decision to evacuate the old town through the city sewers. You can either go north to the Żoliborz district or south to the centre of the city. Priority was given to soldiers, and civilians would have to look after themselves. And by now, everybody knew what being left behind would mean. The evacuation of the old town would take several days, and during this it would be really important that the Germans didn't discover what was going on. Crucial to the defence of the old town was the Polish security printing works, which was again under attack after attack. It's no wonder that conditions there were so terrible, German soldiers started to compare it more to Stalingrad than any other battle that they'd ever fought. At dawn on the 25th of August, members of the Kaliński battalion, including my wife's grandfather, Zygmunt Andrzejewski, finally managed to capture the famous cafe club that connects Jerusalem Avenue with New World Street. For the first time, these streets are connected. Now, Zygmunt told his son, my father-in-law, how they managed to get into the cellar and stole a whole bunch of alcohol before escaping back again, some of the world's best whiskey and brandies. As they're coming back with this stolen booze, a Polish police officer threatens to shoot them. So they pull out their guns, because some things are more important than discipline, and manage to make off with the stolen alcohol. Thanks very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this film, comment underneath, and don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, searching for the hashtag 63days. 26th of August 1944. There's a certain rhythm to the battle in the old town. The bombers come in, they attack the positions, the Polish troops take to the cellars and to the ground floors, and then the Nazis attack, trying to take positions. If they do take them, the Poles counter-attack and frequently retake those positions or reinforce them during the night. The Polish security printing works, the key fortress in the north of the city, is attacked again, and this time the German troops manage to make it into the complex. As a result, the north of the old town, and indeed the whole battle itself, is under threat. The Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, wasn't the only Polish resistance force fighting in the Warsaw Uprising. The Armia Ludowa, or People's Army, which were Polish communists, at this time backed by Soviet Russia, were also fighting. They were a unit of about 50 to 100,000 troops spread out through the whole of Poland. And on this day, the commanders of the Armia Ludowa here in Warsaw were killed in an air attack. Later that day, the remaining troops from the Armia Ludowa left their positions without permission and escaped from the old town to the north of the city, Żoliborz. Those that remain were treated as deserters. Now, it wasn't just Poles of different political allegiances that were fighting to defend Warsaw. We'd already mentioned the Jewish prisoners from the Goose camp, concentration camp, who'd been freed, and many of whom had gone on to serve in the Home Army to fight here in Warsaw. On this day, the Polish underground press printed articles about people from 18 different nationalities that were serving in their ranks, including Germans and Austrians, Hungarians. There were British ex-prisoners of war as well, and even one Nigerian, a former jazz musician and actor called Augusto Brown, who was serving in the Home Army to defend Warsaw, the city that they loved. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of Warsaw, the city that refused to give in. Please share this film and watch out for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 27th of August 1944. Today, the cobbled, pretty streets of Warsaw's old town are peaceful and calm. But on this day, as throughout the whole of August, the fighting for this old town area was intense. A young Polish soldier named Stanisław Likiernik, who'd served in the Polish Underground Army throughout the long years of Nazi occupation and had executed spies, traitors, and SS officers serving in a specialist unit, was ordered into attack. As him and the rest of his troops are running forward, a German soldier jumps out with a flamethrower and tries to kill them. At that exact moment, a strong wind blows back and the soldier ends up setting fire to himself and killing himself. Then, as they move forward again, they're hit by an artillery attack. The rest of his unit are wiped out. Suddenly there's a huge explosion and Likiernik is knocked to the ground. A 1,000-pound heavy bomb has just landed a few yards away from him, but hasn't detonated. The Germans continue to use their remote-controlled Goliath mines to attack the Polish positions. In response, the Poles have their own answer, what they call their Davids, hand grenades. So 3,000 years after the original David versus Goliath fight, the battle is fought again in Warsaw's Old Town streets. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please comment in the comment section below and share this film. Don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's episode, 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 28th of August 1944. After 27 brutal days of fighting, the northern fortress of the Polish security printing works, which for so long had defended the old town from units in the north, finally fell. Its commander, Czesław Lach, had been killed. The remaining troops were forced to pull back to the old town. So I'm actually here in the underground tunnels underneath the Polish security printing works, where for 27 days, injured soldiers and injured civilians were hidden from the gunfire and from the artillery fire. And operating on them was a young doctor called Hanna Petrynowska and just a few nurses. So on the 28th, when the Polish soldiers finally decide to pull out, they face a terrible choice. They have to leave behind the heavily wounded people who can't escape. Hanna Petrynowska refuses to leave. She decides to stay, along with 4 other nurses. And it's probably in this room where Hanna Petrynowska, who'd been operating on the wounded for 2 weeks without any sleep, was finally killed by grenades that were dropped into these tunnels. Her heroism, her courage, lives on with us only in our memories. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising and the Polish security printing works. Tune in for the next episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and don't forget to comment and share this film as well. 29th of August 1944. Why would you continue to fight for a cause if you believed that it was almost certainly lost? One of the reasons why the Polish resistance fighters fighting in the Warsaw Uprising might have carried on is it didn't really matter if they fought or if they didn't fight. If they were caught in uniforms or with weaponry, they were treated by the Nazi Germans as terrorists, shot on spot. It was on this day, after weeks of wrangling, that finally the British and American governments were able to recognise the Polish resistance fighters as competent in the overall Allied war effort. That was a fact that wasn't recognised by the German troops and certainly wasn't recognised by Soviet Russia. Stalin was obsessed with controlling Poland once the war had ended. Democracy was going to be absolutely out of the question. Watching the finest minds of the Home Army destroy themselves in an unequal fight against the Nazis here in Warsaw was absolutely in line with his objectives. When Home Army units east of Warsaw, who'd been liberated by the Soviet army, went to go and meet their brothers in arms, their comrades, the officers would be arrested, imprisoned, sent to Siberia, or executed. Because of the intensity of the fighting, the losses on both sides are heavy. The Germans are losing hundreds of troops a day, and the commander of the German troops, General von den Bach, sends in for reinforcements. On this day, the Elżbietanik Hospital in Mokotów, that had been marked with a gigantic Red Cross flag on the top of the roof, was bombed. One of the nurses serving there, Zofia Kozłowska, called that a war crime. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this episode, write your views in the comments below, and don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 30th of August 1944. Although the decision has been made to evacuate the old town through the sewers into the city centre, there's no way that everybody can get out in time. And everybody knew what being left behind meant. So the Poles hatch a plan for a simultaneous attack both from the old town and the city centre in order to try and create a land bridge between those two places so that many thousands of people would be able to get out in time. At the same time, the Poles plan to use their knowledge of the city sewers to launch surprise attacks and attack from underneath the ground inside the German positions. But again, the fact that the Poles are underarmed and have no real means of communicating between units starts to tell. The attack in the old town is delayed literally because of the crush of civilians who are in the troops' way and blocking their path. The attack in the city centre starts on time, and despite some initial successes knocking out an enemy bunker with a Piat British-supplied rocket launcher, they're eventually rebuffed. Then the Germans start to counter-attack. As a result, there's a real sense of panic in the air. The element of surprise has been lost, and the mission is almost certainly doomed.
So the unit that was sent into the sewers had no way of knowing that the attack that was planned from the old town was late and that the attack from the centre of the city had failed. So they launched their raid at 2 a.m. at Platzbankowa on time. What they didn't realise was that the units there were very heavily armed and they were expecting them. 2 of the manholes had been covered, the 3rd was open. The team lifted the manhole up, ran out into the open, and were cut down by machine gun fire. Only one of them survived. The surprise attack had failed.
By 6 a.m, the daring raid to try and escape from the old town has clearly failed, and the attack is called off. The only way out now is through the disgusting filth, the heat, the stench, and the danger of the sewers. Not everybody will be able to get out in time, and not everybody will. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the inspiring, tragic story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Share your view in the comments section below and share this film with people you think might be interested in this story. 31st of August 1944, the 31st day of the Warsaw Uprising, and one of the bloodiest in the old town's history. Over 1,000 people are killed on this day by heavy bombing raids on the old town. Over 300 people are killed in the Simon's Passage. It's now a race against time to escape the old town before the SS units find out that the Polish Home Army have decided to evacuate through the sewers. The civilians will be left behind, and just a few troops to hold off the SS attacks. Zbigniew Bierzewicz is commanding the 101st Company of the Bądź Battalion, named after its commander. They now face the terrible decision to leave their comrades in arms, heavily injured troops, behind, and the civilians with them. And they come here to Plac Krasiński. There are crowds all around, both civilians and soldiers, desperate to escape the old town before the SS arrive. And this is actually one of the original manhole covers that was used during the Warsaw Uprising. So this is where the resistance fighters would have gone down into the tunnels, into the sewers, in order to be able to escape the old town and get through to the city centre.
Finally, it was Zbigniew's unit's turn to go into the sewers, and his unit used the exact sewer that you see behind me. Now, right now, we've got safety equipment, we've got lighting, and I'm with professional experts, but when thousands of people went through these sewers, there was no lighting, they didn't necessarily know where they were. The threat of grenades going off or petrol being poured down into the sewer holes was very real. Zbigniew described how it was impossible, it was like a dream, something from another reality. There was no sound except the beating of the hearts of the people around him, and his own heart beating like a drum. Each person held on to the person in front of them. If somebody fainted or collapsed, there was no time to stop. They could be trampled underfoot. They had to get out of the tunnels. He said that it was something that he would never really truly be able to describe properly. Then, finally, he sees light. He's hauled out, and he wrote that he tasted the sweetest taste of his entire life. Fresh air. The young boys, men and women of his unit are hauled out, filthy, stinking, exhausted, injured, saved. They emerge from the manholes in the city centre to streets that weren't filled with rubble, on flames. They had glass in their windows. Lukiewicz described how it was like a scene from another world. But it wouldn't stay like that for long. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the men, women and children who had to walk through this filth and this horror for one thing: freedom. Don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's episode of 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Share your view and your reaction to this story in the comments section below, and share this film with someone who you think might appreciate it. Thank you very much.
1st of September 1944. It's the anniversary of the date 5 years before where Germany invaded Poland. And certainly some of the troops and civilians here in Warsaw would have remembered that date. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and Polish crowds turned out in their thousands to thank them in anticipation of the help that would come. Now, 5 years later, Poland, the first to fight, is in a bitter struggle for the heart of its capital. The uprising had been planned to just last a few days, maybe maximum a week before the Russians would arrive. And although Poland was one of the first to fight, it would be one of the last to enjoy freedom. Poland wasn't free in 1945. It was free 45 years later, when the communist government that had been imposed on Poland by Stalin was finally overthrown and replaced with a democratic republic. It was also on this day in 1944 that the Germans finally recognised the Home Army soldiers as Allied combatants. Up until then, they'd been treated as partisans, terrorists, almost certain to be shot on the spot if they were captured or surrendered. This changes the nature of the discussions that the Polish commanders are having with the Germans. Up until now, there's been almost no point in surrendering because they knew that they would be killed anyway. Discussions would carry on throughout September until the Warsaw Uprising would end. In the early hours of the 1st of September, some of the troops who hadn't been able to make it out through the sewers pull off perhaps what's one of the most daring moments of the entire Warsaw Uprising. Dressed head to toe in stolen German uniforms, 60 of them who'd been hiding in a church walk through the German positions, exactly where we are now in the Saxon Gardens, and they're trying to walk as nonchalantly as possible. Stanisław Lechmirovic is at the front of the column when it's finally challenged by a German sentry. "Halt!" he says. "Who are you? What have you been doing?" And the Pole who speaks the best German replies that they've been out killing Poles. They fall into conversation as the troops wait, and as you can probably imagine, it must have been a very tense moment. Eventually the German sentry allows them to pass through, and the Polish commander, Andrzej Domocki, codename Moro, shouts to his troops in theatrical fashion, "Move on up, let's go, let's go, let's go." One of the soldiers next to him claims he deserved an Oscar for the role. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. In tomorrow's episode, you'll find out what happens to those people who are left in the old town. Don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and search for the hashtag 63 Days. 2nd of September 1944, the 33rd day of the Warsaw Uprising. The last troops leave the old town behind me. They race for the sewer manholes, shot at by machine gun fire. As soon as the troops leave, the SS move in. There are 35,000 civilians in the buildings you can see here, and a few thousand heavily injured troops. They shoot the injured troops in their beds or burn them alive with flamethrowers. They carry out selections, killing the elderly and the sick, and also transporting thousands of civilians out of this area as well. If the Nazi troops saved anyone, it was those capable of working. In one room here in the old town, a disabled woman lies in her bed. SS soldiers enter the room and instead of killing her, they set fire to the bed. Her son rushes in, manages to pull her out of the building, but as they emerge, an SS soldier shoots them in the head. After the war, a German soldier, Willi Fiedler, testified how he saw hundreds of Polish people shot from the columns that emerged from the old town. He goes up to one of the SS officers and asks him if it bothers him that he's killing women and children. The officer takes out a cigarette, coolly lights it, turns to him and says, "The Polish nation must be exterminated. Don't worry about it." When you come to Warsaw, you're going to see this column laid out here. This is the Sigismund III column. And a few days after the old town falls, German sappers are sent in, they lay it with explosive charges, and they detonate it. And all the while, the Russians are inching closer and closer to the river. Yet no help comes. And the world, which should have been appalled by the genocide happening here in Warsaw, remains silent. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. In tomorrow's episode, we're going to tell the story of the Cichociemni, the silent and unseen, highly trained special commandos who were dropped deep behind enemy lines into Poland and whose role in the Warsaw Uprising was crucial. Make sure to tune into that episode at 5 p.m. tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Third of September 1944, day 34 of the Warsaw Uprising. So far, we haven't talked very much about the Cichociemni, the so-called silent and unseen, Polish, highly trained commandos attached to the SOE, Special Operations Executive. They were trained up and then parachuted into occupied Poland in order to be able to carry out acts of sabotage and link up with the Polish Home Army. Out of the 300 or so Cichociemni who are parachuted into Poland, at least 100 of them will fight in the Warsaw Uprising and 20 of them are killed. On this day, a Home Army unit led by a Cichociemni member, Adolf Pich, in the Campinos forest north of Warsaw, leads a daring raid on the Rona Brigade that has recently been moved there. You'll remember the Rona Brigade from previous episodes. These were nothing short of sadistic scum of the earth who'd been murdering, raping and pillaging their way through Warsaw in the previous weeks of the uprising. Now, the Rona positions are so heavily defended that a frontal attack would be complete suicide. So Adolf Pich, codenamed Valley, picks a small group of his best men, gives them the best weaponry, and they split up into two pincer movements and attack the Rona fortifications from behind at 1 a.m. on this day. The surprise is total, and they run through the Rona positions, killing 250 of their troops for a loss of just 10 of their own men. The bodies that they find are covered in the valuables that these Rona troops had been stealing throughout the course of the weeks in Warsaw. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Every day, we tell the incredible story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this episode and look out for tomorrow's at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Fourth of September 1944, the 35th day of the Warsaw Uprising. And here in the old town, the Germans are continuing to mop up Polish soldiers and evacuate the civilians here. Now on Kiliński Street, where we are here, the Germans proceed to go into the hospitals and murder the patients with submachine guns, with grenades, and burning them alive. One nurse who survived, Janina Kwiatkowska, saw how a woman called Nina tried to wrestle the gun out of a German soldier's hand as he tried to shoot Nina's husband. The soldier pushed her away and shot both of them. Jerzy Chybowski tries to escape the hospital here in the Raciński Palace, but he's literally physically thrown by a German soldier back into one of the cellars and lands next to another soldier who's got both his legs in plaster casts. A little while later, 2 SS soldiers appear in the darkness and start shooting at them. The man next to Jerzy is hit in the head, and Jerzy is covered in his brains and his blood. The SS soldiers see that Jerzy is trying to feign that he's been killed, so they come a little closer and shoot him directly. They hit him in the face, in the shoulder, and the lungs. But they don't want to get any closer in case they hit themselves, so they go off to find somebody with a machine pistol to finish Jerzy off. On this very night, 74 years ago, Jerzy, covered in another man's brains and blood, and heavily injured himself, somehow finds the strength to crawl out of that cellar, through the darkness, to safety. To my left you can see the electrical power and heating plant, which in the early days of the Rising had fallen into Polish hands, and despite repeated attacks had continued in operation throughout the whole of August. On this day, the Germans finally recapture the electrical plant. For the rest of the uprising, the troops in the old town in the other districts of Warsaw are cut off from electricity. The munitions plants and the hospitals are no longer able to have lighting during the night. It's yet another blow which increases the misery for both soldiers and civilians throughout the Rising. Warsaw's riverside is one of the most enjoyable and beautiful places you can come to if you visit Warsaw. And it's on the 4th of September that the Germans start to pay a lot more attention to the districts which are beside the river, because they know that these are the points where the Soviets could try to come over the river when they finally arrive and make contact with the underground fighters. For the rest of September, German attention will increasingly focus on the Powiśle and Czerniaków districts, Sadyby, Mokotów and Żoliborz. They try and cut them off one by one. Thanks for watching this episode, 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, using the hashtag 63days. "5th of September 1944, day 36 of the Warsaw Uprising. Because of the importance of the riverside districts, just in case the Soviets do try and cross the river, the Polish Home Army decide to send some of their best troops down to Powiśle and Czerniaków to reinforce the units that were there. Those districts up until now had been relatively quiet. Just shy of his 16th birthday, Andrzej Borowiec is one of those soldiers who's led through Warsaw by a very beautiful female guide called Zofia. And Zofia literally picks her way through German-held territory, and they go through bunkers and tunnels and cellars, just like the one behind me in this house. And in one of the houses, they're getting closer and closer to Powiśle, the area where they're going to be stationed. She suddenly turns to the soldier behind her and whispers something into his ear. Then that soldier passes the message on. It says, "Quiet, on the floor above us, there's Germans." And they literally tiptoe, silently as possible, hearts beating in their chest, to go underneath the enemy, to get to the area where they need to be stationed. When he finally arrives in Powiśle, he's amazed, because the district has been relatively unattacked. It's full of grass, there's still glass in the windows, people have got access to fresh water. It feels like another world from the city centre that he's left. But of course, it wouldn't stay like that for long. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you very much for watching this episode. "6th of September 1944, the 37th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Attacks on all of the enclaves and districts around Warsaw continue, particularly here by the riverside in Powiśle, where I am now. On this day at around 12 o'clock, SS troops, led by Oskar Dirlewanger, forced their way onto Smolakowski Street using about 30 men and women as human shields in front of their troops and tanks. They reached the hospital led by Dr. Bolesław Bertenbach, who stayed behind with 7 other people and the priest Michał Czartoryski to look after the 8 heavily injured troops who haven't been able to escape up the hill with everybody else. You can imagine the terror of that moment. The screams outside, the noise, the gunfire, the silence, the thud of the boots. Thud, thud, and then as the doors burst open, the terror as the soldiers run in. At first, an officer assures them they'll be well treated, but 3 hours later, troops re-enter the hospital and bayonet or club to death all of the injured patients left there. They pull the priest out, add him to the group of people who've been used as human shields in order to take this street, push them up against the wall, and shoot them down like dogs, pour petrol on their bodies, and burn them. Just one small, terrible tragedy, one of the many thousands that took place, not just throughout the Warsaw Uprising, but throughout the long years of occupation that Warsaw and her people had to suffer. In 1999, Pope John Paul II made that priest, Michał Czartoryski, a martyr to the faith. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Tomorrow, you'll find out the story about how this part of Warsaw finally fell into German hands. Don't forget to tune into that episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 7th of September 1944. Now, a few decades after it was painted, this red cross marking indicating a hospital point was uncovered and is here to this day. And that's an appropriate symbol because on this day, the 38th day of the Warsaw Uprising, Countess Maria Tarnowska crawled out under sniper fire along with other members of the Home Army, the Polish Home Army, and made contact with the Germans in order to negotiate a ceasefire to get civilians out. The Germans agree, and over the course of the next 2 days, at least 15,000 civilians are able to make their way out of the city centre and out of other districts to safety. It was also on this day that the lower part of Piecemeal behind me finally fell into German hands. A stream of civilians and troops comes running up this hill in order to get into the relative safety of the city centre. Meeting them is Zbigniew Blichewicz, who's appeared in some of our earlier episodes, and he's furious. The old town took weeks to finally fall. Piecemeal is falling in a matter of days. He hears a number of shots somewhere where we are now and goes to investigate. And he discovers some Polish soldiers shooting into a group of Volksdeutsche, Polish citizens of German origin who've been given special status under German occupation in Poland. So Blichewicz immediately orders them to stop shooting into the crowd. And he looks into the eyes of the people that he's just saved. And he sees animal fear, hope, questions, terror, everything. He calls one of the men from that crowd forward and starts to question him. The man swears that he's had nothing to do with the uprising, he hasn't killed anyone, he hasn't served in the German forces. And Blichewicz looks at him, thinking that this could have been somebody that's killed any one of his colleagues. So he asks the man a question. He says, "Tell me, do you deserve to live?" The man looks him in the eye for a brief moment before turning his gaze down to the floor. Blichewicz described how he stared at him in a dull way, perhaps tasting the power that one human can have over another. But he let him go. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. In tomorrow's episode, you're going to hear one of the most chilling tales from the uprising that I've been able to find. It's something that was very difficult for me to record to tell you. Please tune into that episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. "8th of September 1944, the 39th day of the Warsaw Uprising. And I have in my hand a book that was lent to me by my father-in-law. It's about the Odvet Battalion. And if you remember Bogdan Dębicki, we've talked about his stories. Well, he served in that unit. And this book is written by Janusz Kozłowski. And the story that my father-in-law highlighted from this book made my blood run cold. This happened to Janusz on this day, 74 years ago, on the 8th of September in 1944. And I'm going to read this in the first person as Janusz writes it. So he's walking along the street. He sees the bodies of people that had been blown up by artillery rounds, and the bellowing cow, the Nebelwerfer rockets as they come flying in, and he's not even able to tell if they're male or female because they've been completely blown to smithereens. And then he sees a young girl. A young girl is crying out loud somewhere near the bookstore, and I touch her on the shoulders. She raises her face, which is covered in smoke and dirt, and she had these beautiful blue eyes. They were large and they were covered in tears, and her chest is heaving from her crying. She's looked at me, scared. "I'm scared," she said quietly. And I must have looked disgusting. I was in a ripped uniform. I was dirty. My helmet was some random colour. I was unshaved. I looked filthy. The girl stands and cries. I asked her, "Where's your mother?" "I don't know," she said. "And your father, your brother, sister?" "I don't know." "Where do you live?" "What street?" "I don't remember." "How did you get here?" Again, the artillery rounds come flying in, and again they take cover to duck from them in a doorway. Fortunately, this time the explosions are far away. "How did you get here?" I repeat. "A man brought me here." "And where's the man?" "He fell asleep." "What do you mean he fell asleep?" "We were walking, and then suddenly a plane came and something exploded, and the man fell asleep. Afterwards, some people took him to a house, and they said that he was going to sleep for a long, long time. So I went along looking for my mum." And then again she started to cry. So I cuddled her. "Will you come with me?" I asked her. And she said yes. "What's your name?" "Lucia." "And do you know your surname?" "No." "And how old are you, Lucia?" "I'm 5 years old." "Oh, you're already a big girl. And now, Lucia, look out for yourself, because we have to go along this street. And on the other side of the street, there are German soldiers, and you know what that means, don't you?" "Oh yes," she said. Suddenly there's an explosion, and another civilian who's close by to them is hit. He stands up, says a few words to them, collapses, and dies. So they hide there. And again they're hit by rocket fire coming in, and again they duck into a doorway. And Lucia grabs Janusz, holds him by his chest, and just won't let go, to the point where he has to say to her, "Look, you're practically strangling me." And he says, "Don't worry, I'll get you to safety." Finally, the artillery rounds stop flying in, and Janusz carries Lucia in his arms. Then she walks for a bit. "Is there much further to go?" she says. "Just a little while." As they come onto Lvovska Street, which has taken them about an hour and a half, even though it's such a short distance, he says to her, come with me. We're very close. I'm going to get you to somewhere where you're safe." As they're walking along and Lucia's holding his hand, she suddenly slips and falls. Janusz hadn't heard the shot, but he sees suddenly a dark stain on the 5-year-old girl's dress. He grabs her, picks her up, and runs to a first aid point. But the doctor can't do anything. The blood starts flowing from her mouth, and she dies in front of Janusz. I took off my helmet, and the sweat mixed with my tears. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of thousands of young children like Lucia, caught up in a cataclysmic orgy of violence from which there was no escape. In tomorrow's episode, you'll find out what Janusz did to the sniper that killed Lucia beside him. Please tune in for that episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share this film so that other people get to hear about this anonymous girl whose name we'll never know and whose family probably never found out what happened to her. Thank you. September 1944, the 40th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Yesterday, you heard how a 5-year-old girl, Lucia, was shot by a sniper in front of Janusz Kozłowski, who'd been trying to lead her to safety. Today, you get to find out what happened to that sniper. On this day, Janusz and 3 other members of the Odvet battalion set out to get into the building where the sniper is located. He's already killed 9 people. It's their job to finish him. The 4 of them split into 2 pairs, going up separate staircases to get to the attic and loft where they believe the sniper is hiding. Janusz is holding his Polish pistol in his hand so tightly you can feel it, literally the grip shaking. As they get to the top of the stairs, suddenly a grenade is flung at them. The other soldier with him actually played football before the war and ends up booting the grenade away before it explodes. Then they rush the room. The sniper's not there, but the window is open. They race out onto the roof and they see this dark figure trying to hide behind a chimney. Suddenly, the other pair that have gone up a separate staircase start to take aim and shoot at him. So the guy jumps onto a roof opposite. Janusz takes aim and shoots the guy, who falls to the floor. They race down to the street to find the body of the soldier that they've killed. The other soldiers with Janusz are delighted they finally killed an enemy sniper. They've got his weaponry, they've taken his valuables and any food he has on him. But all Janusz can see as he looks down at this dead man's body is the tired, terrified face of Lucia, the little 5-year-old girl that this man had killed. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Tune in for tomorrow's episode when everything changes at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. September 1944, day 41 of the Warsaw Uprising. Suddenly, the morale of civilians and soldiers changes. Soviet planes start to attack German positions on the eastern side of the bank. Again, they can hear Soviet artillery. Finally, could it be true that the Russians are coming? Colonel Felician Majorkiewicz reports that everything changes when the feeling that the Soviets could finally appear and cross this river and come to the aid of the Polish armed fighters. On the 9th, over 10,000 civilians decided to leave the Home Army positions and surrender to the Germans. On the 10th, just under 1,000, and by the 11th, just a few dozen. The Poles are going to fight. They're going to fight on because they believe they can still be saved. Added to which, this night, 20 Allied bombers take off to drop supplies to the beleaguered Polish fighters. 5 of them are Polish, 12 of them are British, and 3 of them are South African. Only 12 of them actually make it here to Warsaw, and when you get to Warsaw, it's not really hard to find the city because it was enveloped in flames and explosions. They've had to fly thousands of kilometres through heavy anti-aircraft fire, especially above the city here. When they drop their loads and then return to base, they're having to fly through a special squadron of night fighters that specialises in picking off bombers that are damaged and the pilots are tired. Of the 20 that take off on this day, 5 are lost. Overall, of the over 300 flights that are made from Allied planes, 13.3% of them are lost. This compares, for example, to the Nuremberg raids, which were often said to be the RAF's darkest hour, where losses run at 11.8%. Stalin has deliberately ordered the 1st Polish Army, led by Zygmunt Berling, to be the ones that are going to approach Warsaw's eastern bank and then cross over the river. And he did this as part of a campaign of misinformation to the Allies, because then he could always claim that indeed the Poles did liberate themselves. The fact that many of the soldiers in this 1st Polish Army had been press-ganged into service when Soviet Russia occupied the eastern part of Poland in the Nazi-German Pact was an inconvenient fact that the West would have to choose to ignore, along with, for example, the murder of thousands of Polish officers at Katyn in 1940. Yes, finally, on day 41, the Russians were coming. But when they arrived, it would not be as liberators or allies, but as an army of occupation. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and don't forget to search for other episodes using the hashtag 63days. 11th September 1944, the 42nd day of the Warsaw Uprising. With Soviet troops finally moving on the eastern side of Warsaw, the Poles drop any talk of surrendering. They've already won combatant status for their soldiers and the promise of no more reprisals. But now they have the determination to carry on fighting. The Germans continue to attack the riverside districts of Czerniaków and Powiśle, as well as the northern district of Żoliborz, focusing all their forces on the areas where the Soviets might be most likely to make a landing. On this day, the Polish Home Army commanders send messages to Marshal Konstanty Rokossowski, pleading for more Russian air supplies to be dropped onto the city. The messages are relayed by the Polish Home Army radio station to London and then sent on to Moscow, but somehow they never reach their end destination. It's not hard to see the hand of Stalin at every turn in this terrible saga, constantly doing something, but not enough, in order to muddle and confuse Western opinion throughout the whole of the Warsaw Uprising. Just a few days earlier, American President Roosevelt, who had always been more amiable to Uncle Joe Stalin than the more suspicious but politically weaker Winston Churchill, wrote to Churchill to say that his military intelligence officers had informed him that the Warsaw Uprising was over, that the commanders had left, and he therefore concluded that there was nothing else that the Allies could do to help the Polish resistance and Home Army. There's nothing we can do. Try telling that to the old men and women huddling in the cellars. Try telling that to the terrified children. Try telling that to the injured patients lying in their hospital beds, or the soldiers fighting on the front line, fighting against despair, fighting the feeling that this has all been in vain. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. In tomorrow's episode, you'll find out how the Poles' religious faith kept them going in these difficult times. Don't forget to tune into tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 12th of September, the 43rd day of the Warsaw Uprising. The Germans pause their attacks on the remaining enclaves of resistance still holding out to focus on Czerniaków, the most likely destination for the Russians to land in order to take Warsaw. In the city centre, Wacław Zagorski sees for the first time 3 Soviet fighters appear above him and engage in a dogfight with 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. One of them gets shot down. It's the first time he's seen any Soviet planes since July. And indeed, it's the first time that the never-ending daily attack of Stuka dive bombers onto Warsaw, which hitherto has been undefended, is finally met with some kind of air resistance. Now, Wacław isn't a particularly religious person, but in the evenings when people gather together for evensong, he hears the evening prayers. And the words go something like this. Wszystkie nasze dzienne sprawy, przyjm litośnie Boże prawe, a gdy będziemy zasypiali, niech ci nawet sen nasz chwali. Which translates as, in all our daily affairs we accept God's laws, and even when we sleep, let our dreams praise him. And on this day, on this exact day, 74 years ago, Wacław hears that simple song sung by those people, and he feels his chest tighten up and tears well in his eyes. Now, the Poles as a rule are a religious people, and very much so in those days. Their faith, their collective faith, helps to keep them going. It helps to keep them fighting for what they believe is right. It helps to keep them believing in their higher purpose, the values which they believe are important, freedom. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. In tomorrow's episode, you're going to hear about the rising panic that takes hold on the eastern side of the river amongst German troops when they start to realise that the Russians truly are coming. The incredible and enormous offensive that is finally launched on this day in 1944. 13th of September 1944, the 44th day of the Warsaw Uprising. The battle in Praga on the eastern side of the river has so far been relatively quiet. The Poles tried to take the northern part of Praga, but they were very quickly defeated by the German units there. Now, this is the front line. Soviet artillery starts to open up on positions on the eastern side of the river. The Russians indeed are coming. Over 150,000 troops are squaring up against 60,000 German troops. Now, Hitler, in his rage, especially having had the failed assassination attempt on his life on the 21st of July, orders Warsaw, like every other city, to be defended to the last man. For the German soldiers on the eastern side of the river, one word starts to dominate: escape. A terrible panic sets in. Nobody wants to be stuck on that side of the river when the Russians come. After all the German atrocities in Russia, they know exactly what's coming for them. So they try and get any means they can to get back across this river. But on this day in 1944, the main escape route, the bridges, are blown up. The Germans take this heavy decision, which means more than anything else that they know this is a battle for Warsaw coming. But that might have been 1,000 miles away for all Zbigniew Biekiewicz, stationed in the centre of the city, cares. On this day in 1944, he assembles his men and checks their ammunition. They've got enough for 15 minutes of fighting. Whilst he's doing that, 2 senior Polish Home Army soldiers arrive and order him and his troops to knock a hole through a wall in order to try and attack a German position. And this wall had been something that the Germans and the Polish had respected. They didn't go beyond this wall. So Biekiewicz is incensed because they're going to have to break this little mini pact. Not only that, but they're going to have to smash through a wall in broad daylight. As they do so, the rounds start flying in, and Biekiewicz, who is renowned for his almost suicidal courage, literally is so sickened by the stupidity of the order that he stands there dumbfounded as these sniper rounds come flying past his head. Earlier in the battle for the Old Town, one of his fellow soldiers had recounted how, as they were ordered into attack, Biekiewicz had jumped up onto the barricade, which was opposite the German troops, and had turned around, sat on the barricade and given his men and soldiers a rousing speech before they went into attack, again with bullets flying past him. This time, having survived this, he's just so disgusted that he does what he usually does when he can, which is jump straight into bed and sleeps. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 14th of September 1944, day 45 of the Warsaw Uprising. Soviet troops are finally on the eastern side of Warsaw's riverbank in the Praga district. In the Warsaw Zoo, they're quite literally fighting between the cages with German soldiers. Panic starts to grip the German high command and troops here, and they start to accelerate their mass theft of valuables from Warsaw City. So Soviet troops have arrived. They are the allies of Poland's allies. They're fighting against a common enemy. So you'd assume that they would be here to help. Wrong. The supplies that the Russians are dropping are often dropped without parachutes, unlike the Allied bombers' supplies. And they fly in from 1,000 feet and quite literally explode on the ground, meaning all the food and equipment inside is destroyed. But at least Stalin can say that he is trying to send supplies in. When the Russian frontline troops arrive in Praga, the locals, who are understandably delighted to finally have seen the Germans off after so many years of oppression and tyranny, celebrate with those troops. However, behind the front line are the NKVD, the forerunner of the Russian KGB. And in a pattern that would be repeated across Poland, they start to look for Home Army soldiers, and when they find them, they arrest them. They arrest the officers, and then they press gang the Home Army soldiers, privates, corporals, etc., into the Red Army. In Cherniakov, the Radosław group comes under constant heavy bombardment from artillery and air attacks. They're running low on ammunition, just 20 rounds for every heavy machine gun, 20 for every submachine gun, and between 50 and 100 rounds for each of the rifles. They just simply do not have the ammunition to keep fighting. To Stalin, the Polish Home Army weren't soldiers, as had been recognised by the British and the Americans, and even by now the Germans. And he continues to use the term partisan or terrorist when he's talking about the Polish Home Army to Churchill and Roosevelt. And his military intelligence and NKVD officers knew exactly what to tell Stalin when they sent reports back to him. They were telling him that the Home Army were actually cooperating with the Germans, not fighting against them. It's just this terrible, tragic irony that the people who you were supposed to be fighting with against a common enemy were actually also your enemy. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. In tomorrow's episode, I'll tell you the story of the women who fought alongside the men in Poland's Home Army. Don't forget to tune into that episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you. 15th of September 1944, the 46th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and Stanisław Likiernik is here in the Czerniaków district fighting. One of the soldiers in his unit is shot in the street and lies there bleeding, calling out for help. A female soldier, whose name he doesn't even know, runs out, takes the man by the arms and under heavy fire pulls him to safety. Throughout this series, whenever I've talked about the soldiers of the Home Army, I've meant women as much as men. They were every bit as brave and courageous as their male counterparts. The Germans attack the tanks, firing ceaselessly, and a rocket grenade explodes next to Stanisław Likiernik. The soldier opposite him is killed, and a female soldier next to him has his legs blown off. The first doctor who gets to Likiernik sees that he's absolutely covered in wounds and bleeding heavily, and is convinced that there's absolutely no chance for him. Likiernik is in so much pain that he'd shoot himself with his rifle if he could, but unfortunately his hands are paralysed and he's unable to. They've got to get away, and two female soldiers carry Likiernik, not by mistake to a hospital, but to a house nearby here on Okrąg Street. About 10 minutes later, he's carried to another house by another female soldier, and the building that he was in before is blown up by a Goliath explosive mini tank. Literally at every minute in Warsaw during this fight, you can meet your maker. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the men and the women of the Warsaw Uprising. In tomorrow's episode, you'll find out what happens when Soviet troops finally do cross the river, but the help that they give is piecemeal at best. Tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 16th September 1944, the 47th day of the Warsaw Uprising. In the enclaves of the city that are still in Polish hands, they're still fighting, street by street, building by building, and even floor by floor. Because of the number of dead soldiers and dead civilians, they're running out of space in the streets and in the public squares of places where they can actually bury the bodies of the dead. In Żoliborz, the fighting continues to be intense, with the 26th Panzer Division losing 110 killed and 240 injured. In Mokotów, due to the pressure of the attacks, the Polish resistance is forced into an ever tighter circle. 16-year-old Andrzej Borowiec is here in the Czerniaków district on ulica Okrąg, not far from where I live. And the morning is peaceful when all of a sudden light mortars open up and heavy machine gun fire. And he suddenly hears a dreaded sound, tanks, one of the enemies that they find hardest to fight back against. Then he hears an even stranger sound. It's the Eastern Polish accent of soldiers of the 1st Polish Division, part of the Soviet Army. Finally, the Russians have crossed the river. At 4 a.m. on the morning on this day in 1944, Soviet troops jumped into thin-skinned boats and started moving across the wide, fast-flowing Vistula River. I remember watching this as a demonstration a few years ago and was shocked by just how slow those boats were moving. A young soldier, Stanisław Komorski, watches from the western side of the river and sees the fountains exploding from the mortars that the Germans are sending over in the artillery and the heavy machine gun striking sparks into the water. He hears the screams of the Soviet troops as they're shot, the injured, and they start drowning as the boats disintegrate in the fast-moving river. About 300 troops make it over in the first crossing and up to 2,000 thereafter. And later on, Jan Mazurkiewicz, the leader of the elite Radosław group, has been sent down to the Powiśle and Czerniaków districts in order to hold this area to enable the Soviets to cross the river, is finally able to meet the commander of the Soviet troops that have come across. Like the Polish Home Army, the Berling Officer, as they were called, were soldiers comprised of both men and women. And Mazurkiewicz is absolutely overjoyed, finally help has arrived. However, Soviet planes weren't used to support their troops in the crossing, and nor was Soviet artillery. The help that had come, whilst it was welcome, was still piecemeal. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. In tomorrow's episode, you'll find out what happens when those Soviet troops finally go into action alongside the Polish Home Army against the Germans. Tune in for that episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 17th of September 1944, the 48th day of the Warsaw Uprising. If by now you think that this series has gone on for a long time, imagine what it was like to be fighting and living inside Warsaw throughout all of this period. And this fight not only went up until now, it went on for very much longer as well. In the incredibly difficult and unsanitary conditions the Warsaw found itself in, diseases at this time start to break out. Wacław Zagorski's underground resistance friend, Tadeusz, is cut in half by a mortar explosion in front of Wacław, and he suddenly finds himself reflecting on the fact that he doesn't actually really know anything about Tadeusz. Such was the level of secrecy that the underground kept in those long years of resistance. The same is also true of another hero from this season, Bogdan Dębicki, who didn't even know that his brother, who was living in the same house, was also a member of the resistance. But at least for the first time, help is at hand, and soldiers of the 1st Polish Army of the Red Army are across, and they're here to help. The Polish Home Army marvel at the equipment that they bring with them. But the Soviet Army had none of the close-quarter tactical experience that the Polish Home Army had paid such a price in blood and lives to learn. And the Russian commanders of these Polish troops care little about their men as far as they're concerned. They're expendable. So consequently, the losses of these farm boys who were sent out into the open and shot down in their droves are very heavy indeed. General Komorowski, the leader of the Polish Home Army, tries desperately to make contact with the Russians who are massing on the eastern side of the river. He sends over 7 soldiers, and despite taking 3 days, they're unable to make contact. He tries to set up a radio link, but that fails. And he even plans to use underground cables to establish a constant telephone line, but that doesn't work either. In London, representatives of the Polish government are making treaties to the Russians, but are kicked out. Yet more signs that, despite the piecemeal help that's been sent over, the Soviets are determined not to assist in any meaningful way. Reports come into the Home Army that on the eastern side of the river, the Russians are arresting anyone who belongs to the Home Army. They're sending the officers off to the gulags, and they're press-ganging the privates and junior members of the Home Army into service on their side. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the inspiring, tragic story of the Warsaw Uprising. Don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we'll tell the story of one of the largest airdrops that ever came to Warsaw's aid. 18th September 1944, the 49th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and the skies above Warsaw are roaring with life, roaring with noise, roaring with the engine of over 100 American B-17 flying fortresses that are dropping supplies onto the Polish Home Army positions. The B-17 is one of the most beautiful bombers of the Second World War, and altogether over 1,200 canisters are dropped onto the city. In the city centre, Wacław Zagorski runs out with everybody else to get a view, the incredible sight of this view of these planes coming over. People are so excited that they even stand and jump onto the graves so they can get a better view. Could this finally be the parachutists that they've been dreaming of coming ever since the Warsaw Uprising began? But no, parachutes open in the sky and canisters fall onto the ground. But less than 1 in 5 actually lands in Home Army territory. So the supplies that they desperately need don't get to them. You can imagine the frustration as every day goes on and when help seems so close at hand, but it doesn't arrive. One of the packages that Wacław is able to get his hand on touches him deeply. Inside the canister is a packet of blood that's been donated by a Polish compatriot living in Scotland. The Cherniaków district comes under intense fire, and the troops of the elite Radosław group are pushed into smaller and smaller circles of defence. As usual, whenever the Germans find anyone hiding in a cellar, if they refuse to come out, they throw grenades in or shoot them where they find them. They kill the injured wherever they can get their hands on them as well. Now, amongst the Polish troops, there are soldiers of the Soviet Army, Polish troops serving in the 1st Polish Division. But the mass landing of Soviet troops onto the western side of the river hasn't happened. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and share your reaction to this film in the comments section below. 19th September 1944, day 50 of the longest uprising that any European city sees throughout the course of the Second World War. In Prague, 4 days of fighting continued before the Soviet soldiers finally entered the city. Paris needed just 6 days before the German commander there surrendered. Warsaw occupies a quite unique place in the annals of the Second World War, the darkest chapter that any city could claim in the darkest chapter of human civilization to date. On this day, the Soviet soldiers of the Polish First Army, who've landed on the western side of the riverbank to support the Polish Home Army, decide to pull back. There's going to be no more support from troops to help the Polish Army in this fight. 16-year-old Andrzej Borowiec accompanies an injured soldier down to the riverbank before he's evacuated into a boat. And in return, the man gives him his Mosin Nagant standard Soviet rifle. Andrzej's obviously delighted because throughout the Warsaw Uprising, almost nobody really owned their own gun. They were passed from hand to hand, depending on the fight. And now he's able to claim this one as his own. So now Jan Mazurkiewicz, the commander of the Polish forces in the Czerniaków district, is forced to make a tough choice. His units can't keep defending the district from the troops of Oskar Dirlewanger, whose sadistic, brutal murderers have raped, pillaged, and destroyed many other districts of Warsaw before then. So he's forced to make the tough choice to evacuate the Czerniaków district. His men are going to have to get out any which way they can. Some try to make it with Soviet soldiers in pontoon boats across the Vistula River. Others try and make a mad dash through German lines. But the majority choose a tried and tested method of escape during the Warsaw Uprising, the sewers, from the Czerniaków district to the Mokotów district. One of them is Andrzej Borowiec. Just the day before, this 16-year-old had killed his first man. Now he's making his second escape, this time from Czerniaków to Mokotów, having escaped through the sewers from the old town to the city centre. He emerges into the Mokotów district, where things are again quiet, and he's surprised by the fact there's glass and there's still buildings that are undamaged. In total, the Radosław group, which at the start of the uprising numbered 1,500 men, is down to 200 men. And whilst Mokotów is quiet, it won't stay that way for long. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please share this film and your comment in the comment section below. 20th of September 1944, the 51st day in the battle for Warsaw, a battle that seems as if it will never end. Zbigniew Brychewicz wakes up on this day and he's cold, freezing cold. The hot summer is starting to turn into the autumn, and Zbigniew has been fighting throughout this whole time in just his shirt sleeves. When he first emerged from the tunnels from the old town into the city centre, it seemed as if it was another world. Now, the fire-gutted buildings splattered with bullet holes and shrapnel holes, reminding him of the old town that bled to death and was fought so hard over. Jerzy Dzerzhinsky is in the Czerniaków district, which the Polish soldiers have decided to evacuate, but he's cut off from the escape and he has nowhere to go. His best friend is killed in front of him when they try and find a way to get out of the madness. So then he takes to the cellars on Okrąg Street. Finally, the Germans arrive. They beat him, steal everything of valuable that he owns. They separate the men from the women. Then they order the men to burn the bodies of the Polish people that they've killed. Then Jerzy is forced to sit there with the others and listen to the sounds as the SS soldiers rape the women they've been with. We've talked all along about the role of children supporting the Warsaw Uprising. They mostly served in auxiliary roles as messengers, postboys, nurses, and other supportive areas. But on this day, the youngest official soldier, Witold Modelski, was killed. His house had been burnt out. He fought in the old town and then made it through the sewers to the city centre, where he fought again, and then again in Czerniaków. He was decorated for bravery on the 23rd of August and killed defending a building not far from where we are now. He was 12 years old. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 21st of September 1944, the 52nd day of the Warsaw Uprising. And on this day, German attention turns to the Mokotów district, just south of the city centre, which up until now has been, relatively speaking, a quiet sector. The Stuka dive bombers start to attack and heavy artillery rounds start to land. The Polish soldiers here are completely exhausted and they're down to their last few rounds of ammunition. The cumulative exhaustion of fighting without pause for so many weeks is starting to show. A few days earlier, Stalin had finally relented and allowed Allied bombers flying from Britain or Italy to drop supplies into Warsaw and then fly on to refuel and rearm at Soviet bases. These were called frantic missions, and whilst there were many before the Warsaw Uprising and some afterwards, these were the last of the frantic missions that would be flown for Warsaw. We'll never know what kind of difference it would have made if Stalin had opened up his air bases to more frantic missions throughout the course of the Warsaw Uprising. But certainly his pattern of behaviour, his lack of support, loomed ominously over the future of Poland and its capital, Warsaw, fighting to its last round, its last man, its last breath for its freedom. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please share this film and your reaction in the comments section below. And tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 22nd of September 1944, the 53rd day of the Warsaw Uprising. And Warsaw now starts to resemble something that you might see on your television screens in Syria. Russian heavy artillery starts to attack Warsaw and attack German strongholds, but of course, not every round lands in the right place. Warsaw had been heavily bombed in the German campaign to take Poland in 1939. The Warsaw Ghetto had been completely obliterated in 1943. And then in the citywide destruction, the city had been completely eviscerated. And now, Russian and German heavy artillery start to attack and counterfire at each other throughout the city, just further adding to the misery and to the damage and destruction. The Germans have always planned to focus all of their energy and forces on the city centre only once they dealt with the remaining separate strongholds throughout the city. The Poles estimate that there's over 250,000 civilians now stuck inside the city centre, awaiting their fate. In Cherniaków, the Nazis continue to kill injured and civilians discriminately, where literally life hangs on a thread and you never know if you'll be able to get out. In their desperation, people rush to the riverside to try and cross the Vistula River. The Germans open up with every kind of weapon they have, and the bodies lie around in their hundreds. And Russian counterfire also lands on people as they're trying to get into the boats to escape. One woman, Lydia, carries her heavily wounded husband down to the riverside, and she finds a space on a boat, but they refuse to take him because he's almost certainly dead. So she pulls out a gun and threatens them. Reluctantly, they agree, and Lydia swims alongside the boat across the Vistula under artillery fire, mortar fire, and heavy machine gun fire. You can imagine what that experience must have been like for her. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of desperate, starving, hungry, tortured people like Lydia, who were forced to make extraordinary decisions to save the people they love. Please share this film and your reaction in the comments below, and tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 23rd of September 1944, the 54th day of the Warsaw Uprising. And Stalin sends a signal to the American commanders to tell them that the commanders of the Warsaw Uprising have now fled the city and are controlling it from a remote location, but they can't be found. The level of disinformation coming from the Soviet side makes it very hard for a concerted Allied effort and approach towards the Warsaw Uprising. Not surprisingly, many could and indeed did feel bitter towards the Allies for their lack of support, be they British, American or Soviet. Stalin has a puppet government which he's waiting to install the moment that Warsaw falls, which surely must be any day now. Because of its physical location and because of the immense Soviet contribution to the war, Poland falls once again victim to international politics, played out at scale on Warsaw streets. Cherniaków is now fully controlled by the Germans, and as has become a kind of depressing normality, they kill any injured and soldiers they find, and rape any women that they can get their hands on. Tadeusz Lubowski is with a group of people who are captured. They find a pistol on one of the women there, and they kill her immediately. They hang a priest with his own robes. Hundreds of bodies lie strewn around the place, and the contents of homes are emptied out. It was, quite literally, hell on earth. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the tragic but inspiring story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please support this project by sharing this film, giving your reaction in the comments section below, and tuning in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 24th September 1944, the 55th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Mokotów is now the focus of the battle. 16-year-old Andrzej Borowiec is celebrating his birthday at his observation post, watching small groups in front of him scurry back and forth, when suddenly all hell breaks loose and they open up on his position. Tanks from the Hermann Goering Panzer Division attack from the west and south, accompanied by Panzer Grenadier foot soldiers and remote-controlled Goliath mines. Fortunately, the troops in Mokotów are able to use their British-supplied airdropped Piat anti-tank rocket launchers to fight the attack off. Not for the first time, Andrzej, like many other soldiers, finds himself wishing he was back in the cobbled, densely packed and narrow streets of the old town where defence was, relatively speaking, easier. However desperate the situation was for the Poles, it was tough going for the Germans as well, and the German commanders start to blame each other for the slow lack of progress. They send in 2 captured Polish officers back into Mokotów and offer to allow the civilians to escape, but with the threat that if they don't, they're going to flatten Mokotów as they have the other districts of the city. Again, the Polish civilians trapped in these districts are faced with a terrible choice. Do they trust the promises of safety and a passage out of Warsaw, or do they stay alongside the soldiers? On this occasion, 9,000 civilians left the Mokotów district on this day, and they're taken through the transit centre to the southwest of Poland and out of the city. Thanks for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the extraordinary Warsaw Uprising, a story which is almost completely unheard of outside of Poland. Please share this episode and your reaction in the comments section below. And don't forget to tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 25th of September 1944, the 56th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Attacks on the Mokotów district, where I am now, continue to intensify. 16-year-old Andrzej Borowiec is celebrating his birthday on this day when he's hit by grenade shrapnel. He refuses to leave his post, drenching his weapon in his own blood. His female colleague who's treating him is hit as well, and they both lie there in this forward observation post, drenched in their own blood, awaiting an enemy that's getting closer and closer and closer. Mokotów, like the other districts of the old town, Sadyba and Czerniaków, is about to fall. And the Poles have to make their escape, as they have done so many times before, through the sewers. Andrzej is absolutely terrified. He can't go into the sewers with his open wounds, he's too heavily injured. On the other hand, if he stays behind, he's pretty much convinced that he'll be killed. One by one, he watches as his unit disappears into the sewers, before finally deciding to stay. Some of his colleagues say goodbye, thinking they'll never see him again. Some of them tell him he's crazy for staying. But he says, I don't care. He's too exhausted, he's too tired, and he can't go down into those sewers again. Finally, he's left on his own, and he staggers to a hospital and waits with the other wounded, who are all terrified that they're about to be killed. The nurses strip him of his uniform and go off to try and find some clothes for him from one of the houses that are now lying empty. What happens to him next is beyond the realms of the absurd. The Germans do take the hospital, but this time they don't kill the injured. And Andrzej Borowiec, who's 16 years old and has fought for 56 days without pause, is led out of the hospital dressed in a dinner jacket or tuxedo and nothing else. As the injured wait to be evacuated, General Ruhr, the German commander, enters into the hospital and makes a short speech. He praises them for their bravery, before expressing regret that the Germans and Polish soldiers didn't fight together against the communists. As the general's leaving, they hear explosions in the distance. It's Soviet heavy artillery again firing onto Warsaw, onto German strongholds. The general turns to the Polish injured soldiers and says, "That's your Russian friends." Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. Please tune in to tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 26th of September 1944, the 57th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, not everybody was as fortunate as Andrzej Borowiec, who yesterday was captured in a hospital and evacuated from the Mokotów district. In 2 other hospitals in the same area, German soldiers enter and they find injured soldiers and injured civilians lying around in the rooms. They pour petrol over their bodies and burn them to death. To the north of Mokotów, 98 resistance fighters who've entered into the sewer tunnels to try and escape the district emerge out into the street, thinking that they finally made it back into Polish lines and to safety. In fact, they're walking straight into German positions. They're hauled out of the sewers, forced onto their knees, lined up in a row, beaten around the head, and shot down in their droves. Despite this, for the majority of soldiers who are captured, they're treated as exactly that, soldiers, and marched out of Mokotów onto a long journey, either to a concentration camp, to a prisoner of war camp, or to a labour camp. For any Jews that have been able to survive in Warsaw throughout the long years of occupation, this was a particularly dangerous time. If caught, they'd be shot on the spot. So Mokotów has fallen, and now German focus is on Żoliborz, the northern district of Warsaw. And they repeat their standard approach of using heavy artillery and heavy air attacks, as well as tanks and infantry and Goliath mines. Commanding the Polish forces there is Mieczysław Niedzielski, codename Host. Now, some Russian troops also managed to make it across and establish a bridgehead and join forces with Niedzielski's troops. But the repeated promises of additional landings haven't happened. Niedzielski is on his own. He has to continue the fight. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And don't forget to share your reaction in the comments section below. 27th September 1944, the 58th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, we're here not too far away from ulica Dworkowa, where yesterday I told the story of over 100 resistance fighters who went into the sewers and emerged through the tunnels into German lines and were shot down. By now, the Germans have completely understood the strategic importance of these cramped, confined, filthy tunnels, and they're blocking them, blowing them up, mining them, and pouring petrol in to burn the people and deprive them of oxygen. The Nazis have now realised that if they kill civilians, it actually slows them down. So they have been assuring civilians that they'll treat them well and evacuate them from Warsaw. In Mokotów, anyone who doesn't trust them and stays behind, as the German soldiers move in and clear each house one by one, they'll kill all the civilians left. So often in this battle for Warsaw, the decision to stay or go, remain or try and escape, literally meant the difference between life and death. And nobody had any certainty or security that the decision they were making was the right one. So you can imagine the terror, the confusion and the chaos as the boots are heard racing up the stairs and along the streets in Mokotów. And now attention is turning to Żoliborz. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. 28th of September 1944, day 59 of the Warsaw Uprising. Mokotów was fallen and Żoliborz is being pounded. Now German attention can turn towards the city centre. Over 250,000 civilians have crowded into the bunkers, the tunnels, the houses, the cellars from all the other districts that have now been completely destroyed and retaken by the Germans. It's always been General von den Bach's, the overall German commander of Warsaw, intention to capture the city centre only once he's dealt with these outlying districts. By now, the desperate hunger that we've talked about in many of the previous episodes and the lack of supplies are making conditions incredibly difficult to deal with. The wounded lie bleeding and in pain because there's no more bandages left and there's certainly no more medicine. So there's nothing the doctors can do for them. Children are starting to die from hunger. And it's no surprise that almost everybody is suffering from chronic dysentery and diarrhea. So you can imagine what the morale amongst the civilians who are in the city centre was like. It was desperate. And as the uprising went on, it got worse and worse. Added to which, as the nights get colder and colder, they're unable to light fires because they'll draw in artillery rounds and sniper fire as well. Now, throughout the making of this series, I've been asking myself the question, how is it that civilians could keep going? Not why did they join the rising or why did they support the rising, but just how could they keep going? And yet, keep going they did, with that maddeningly unquenchable, unbreakable spirit to resist and determination to survive. It was a unique courage in of itself, and it was utterly, utterly Polish. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. Please share this episode and go back and watch the playlist to find all the other episodes from this long battle and this extraordinary story. Tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 29th September 1944, day 60 of the Warsaw Uprising. The commanders of the Polish Home Army send desperate messages to the Russians, saying, look, if you can't supply us, if you can't support us over the next coming days, then we don't think we're going to be able to hold out much longer. Stanisław Krupa makes it down to the riverside with hundreds of other people who are trying to get out of the city. And a Polish commander asks for 3 volunteers to swim across the Vistula river in order to ask the Soviets to send for a boat to come back and pick people up. He asks for 3 on the basis that at least one of them might be able to make it. Stanisław volunteers despite the fact that he's injured and he's got his arm in his sling. So he and the 2 others creep down to the riverside, and they are literally creeping past the bodies of hundreds of other people who've massed down by the riverside and been hit by artillery and bullets. They jump into the river, and it's only now that Stanisław pulls his injured arm out of his sling and starts to swim furiously as fast as he possibly can, despite the fact he's exhausted and has hardly eaten for days, across the river. Bullets slap the water around him, and the sky is lit up by explosions, searchlights and tracer rounds. As he and the other swimmers get to the eastern side of the river, the world seems to erupt as the Germans lob rocket grenades onto their position to try and kill these messengers. By the time he finally reaches the Soviet commander, he's utterly shattered and so cold he can barely force the words out. The Soviet commander refuses his request to send a boat over to help those people trapped on the western riverside. He's then put into a hospital where local Polish people warn him that the NKVD are almost certainly going to arrest him. He escapes the hospital and, true to their word, is chased by NKVD agents down the street but manages to get away. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. The Warsaw Uprising is slowly coming to an end. This incredible resistance, which has fought for so long, is slowly being pulled and torn apart by the sheer weight of the enemy forces fighting against it. Please share your reaction to this film and this entire series, and share this film as well. Look out for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you. 30th of September 1944, the 61st day of the Warsaw Uprising. And on this day, Hitler awards honours to the German commanders who have led the fight back against the Polish Home Army throughout the Warsaw Uprising. General Reinfarth is awarded the Iron Cross with oak leaves. Reinfarth's troops have murdered, robbed and raped their way across the whole of Warsaw. He is directly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, men, women and children. But like many war criminals of this type, Reinfarth actually escapes any form of justice after the war and goes on to live a quite prosperous life as a lawyer and then as mayor of a town, continuing to draw his military pension until the end of his life. His tens of thousands of victims remain forgotten. In the north of Warsaw, the Żoliborz district is finally forced to surrender. After the war, General von den Bach, the commander of the German troops, testified that the commander of the Żoliborz district, Mieczysław Niedzierski, was a true hero and, ironically describing him as a real fanatic, who refused any talk of capitulation. Indeed, it's said that when the Germans first offered to do talks on surrender, he replied, "Thank you very much for your offer. We're ready to accept your surrender at any time." And he gave them the details of where they could drop off their weapons. Now Niedzierski, who's been twice injured in battle, is led away to captivity in crutches, where he's later arrested by the Gestapo and placed in a concentration camp before being freed in 1945. Unlike Reinfarth, Niedzierski is unable to go home, and like so many of the Home Army soldiers who fought in Warsaw, unable to return to Poland because they'll be arrested by the Soviets, Niedzierski is forced to make his life in another land and works as a labourer, living in relative poverty in the US until his death. Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we celebrate and honour the memory of people like Mieczysław Niedzierski and the tens of thousands of victims of mass murderers like Reinfarth. Please share this episode and indeed watch all of the episodes from this season, and tune in for tomorrow's episode at 5 p.m. Warsaw time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 1st of October 1944, the 62nd day of the Warsaw Uprising. The commander of the Polish forces in Warsaw, General Komorowski, writes to the Polish president-in-exile based in London to say that there's no more realistic hope of being able to defend Warsaw, and as a result, he's going to surrender. Leszek Prorok is one of the many thousands of soldiers now thinking, what's next? A work camp? A prisoner camp? A concentration camp? He sees many people around him stashing away valuables and weaponry in the hope of being able to recover them after the war. Although the Home Army in Warsaw might be thinking of surrendering, the Poles themselves most definitely are not. Witold Pilecki, an incredible hero who volunteered to go into Auschwitz, set up the resistance there, broke out of the camp, having been there for 900 days, made his way back to Warsaw and fought in the Warsaw Uprising, where he led one of the most important units defending Jerusalem Avenue, is one of those soldiers who's now thinking of the future. He goes into an apartment owned by the mother of one of the soldiers he's been fighting with and stashes away 2 submachine guns, 4 heavy machine guns, dozens of grenades and thousands of rounds. Now, there are very few of these old buildings left in Warsaw, but whenever I'm in one of these old tenement blocks and apartment blocks, many of them you can see pickpocketed by shell marks and bullet marks, I always think just what incredible things would be hidden behind these walls if you could find out. Pilecki is a member of an organisation called Nie, which was dedicated to fighting for Poland's liberty after the Germans had left and when it was occupied by the Soviets. When General Eisenhower visited Warsaw after the war, he said, "I have been and seen much destruction, but I've never seen anything on a scale like Warsaw." Thank you very much for watching this episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage, where every day we tell the story of the Warsaw Uprising. The battle itself is slowly coming to an end, but the memory of it will never die on. Please share this film so that others find out about the story of the uprising, and share your reaction in the comments section below. 2nd of October 1944, the 63rd day of the Warsaw Uprising. A battle that was supposed to only last for a few days, perhaps at most a week, has gone on for 63 days. The longest fight of any capital city throughout the Second World War. At 9 p.m. on this day, the Polish Home Army commander signs the order to cease fire. Polish soldiers will lay down their arms over the coming days and march into captivity to a work camp, a labour camp, concentration camp, or even set free. They leave behind graves exactly like these ones, marking the fallen soldiers and comrades, their civilians, their mothers, their wives, their sisters, their daughters, their fathers, their husbands, whose souls will never leave Warsaw. Less than 1,000 people remain in Warsaw, amongst them Władysław Szpilman, the hero of the book and film The Pianist. Although Soviet troops reach the eastern riverbank of Warsaw, they don't enter the city until January 1945, giving the German troops stationed there plenty of time to fulfill Himmler's orders to demolish the city, street by street, building by building, brick by brick. Special squads continue to, quite literally, reap anything they can of any kind of value. They burn whole libraries, they steal artworks, anything that's valuable that gets stolen. And then the buildings are destroyed, blown up, burnt down, or heavily mined. The scale of the destruction is really quite incredible. By the end of the Second World War, 85% of the entire city of Warsaw would have been completely and utterly destroyed. The damage alone during the Warsaw Uprising is estimated as much as $50 billion US. Over 1 million people have lost everything they own and their homes, and almost 250,000 people have been killed just in this one battle alone. This 47-metre high mound that we're now on is made up of the ruins of buildings that were driven here and dumped when Warsaw was actually rebuilt. To this day, a debate remains as to whether the Warsaw Uprising was the right decision or not. And although we've touched on that subject, what we've tried to do throughout the whole of this 63-episode series is tell the story of the men, women, children who fought and died in this city. I'm incredibly grateful that the Polish Security Printing Works Fortress Foundation has been able to partner with me to make this series possible. Now, although the Warsaw Uprising is one of the most extraordinary battles of the Second World War, it's also one of the least understood. And that's why we know that this series will remain for 5, 10, 15, 20 years as a testament to those people. What we've tried to do throughout the course of this is tell people the story in short, accessible format. And it's frankly been not my honour to give this to you, but really I'm so grateful because I've learned so much about the Warsaw Uprising. And the stories that I've told throughout the course of this series have touched me very deeply. Very often I've been moved to tears by what I've felt and what I've heard. But now the future of this story lies in your hands. If you have been moved by what you've heard, if you've been touched by the story of people who refuse to give up, refuse to give in, who know what freedom means and are prepared to lay down their lives to defend it, then I ask you now to share this film, go back and watch the whole of this series, and remember, because there are some things in life worth dying for, and nobody knows that better than the people of Warsaw. Thank you very much for watching this last episode of 63 Days of Extraordinary Courage. I'd like to thank you very, very much for joining me, and also thank very much the team at the Polish Security Printing Works, as well as Marek Iwaszkiewicz and Filip Staszewski. All of you have been absolutely fantastic, and I will remain forever grateful for the opportunity to share Warsaw's story with so many people. In the end, there can only be one last thing to say. Cześć I chwała. Bohaterom.